This is my path to activism, and I've broken it down into what I feel are five meaningful, actionable steps along that path. This path begins with examining my purpose. What is the goal? What are the outcomes of this action plan? And it begins with examining my capacity as an educator and enhancing my capacity as an educator to engage in effective anti-oppressive practices. My action plan begins with truly examining my role as a teacher, focusing on what I can contribute in addition to direct curricular instruction. As a 21st century educator in modern society, I do believe that our job entails much more than just the curricular academic necessities and features a lot more in terms of social and emotional learning, in terms of especially equity and anti-oppression as our society becomes more and more interconnected and we see inequalities and oppression continue to persist. Following this, I will review my practices of enabling my students to meaningfully engage in democratic processes. And lastly, taking action in my daily teaching practices will be the means to implementing real change. My ideal outcome from the implementation of my action plan is to foster a high quality exemplar of an anti oppressive, equity framed classroom. I will challenge myself throughout the action plan to come at structures and scenarios from an anti oppressive and equity framed lens, deeply examining the biases and assumptions within my teaching practices. I like to feel that I'm accommodating, that I am welcoming and understanding. But as I've learned over the course of our course here, I have realized that there's a lot more nuance in terms of anti-oppression and equity framed that I'll establish a little further here. So to begin, I need to look at my role as a teacher. Now, this for me was the Brian Charest text in its entirety, in particular towards the end of the text where he focuses on what it means to be a citizen teacher. And this was my biggest takeaway in terms of what does it mean to be a 21st century educator. And to me, and from Charest's perspective, and I agree with it, is that it means to be someone who strives to expand and strengthen institutions and human relations that support participatory democracy. Democracy is a key theme when we talk about anti-oppression and equity-framed society because it means that every voice is honored and incorporated. And thinking further than this, thinking about my own understandings, thinking about linking the work of teaching with broader questions of equity and justice in society, thinking about what educators and what myself and my own capacity can do to promote or to inspire or to make aware challenges facing oppression and lack of equity, and what we can do to change that, to grow, to progress um, our contribution to society. I will also actively participate in these processes and not just lecture about them. It's very easy to talk about all of the wrongs in the world, easy to talk about the challenges and such, but talk is cheap, action is much more worth it. So indicating, demonstrating how I carry myself, how I conduct myself, how I engage with my students, colleagues, peers, community, and so on, I think are actionable steps to make meaningful change. And lastly, making sure that I focus on resisting an academic-only perspective of our role. It's easy to look at Saskatchewan government, Saskatchewan curriculum, and say, well, here's my job description. This is all I have to do. That is not the case in the 21st century classroom anymore, where we have so many different facets of society and many different components of privilege and lack of privilege and um, economic success and lack of economic success and what comes with that. So understanding my role as an educator, I think, is the first key step in being able to foster an anti-oppressive, equity-focused classroom. Step 3 here focuses on exploring the present reality and future potential of children as democratic citizens. We had a number of articles in topic 5 focusing on the democratic process and children's role within that process that I think is worthwhile discussing and that I do think is integral to promoting the anti-oppressive equity framed classroom that I aspire towards. Cohen led off this topic focusing on what children rights exist at present, and she made a good comment about how children possess rights of citizenship, but they do not have full participation in democratic society. Decisions are made for them. They are delegated in terms of who gets to speak for them and how often their voice is spoken up. Oftentimes, politicians and society in general talk around children as opposed to with children or for children. So I do think it's important that children's voices are incorporated more meaningfully than they presently are. Um, Linus focuses on in their article, focusing on what does children's participation look like? What is its significance? How can it be demonstrated? And focusing on children's agency in the way that they are in a position to voice their interests, and that these interests are recognized through decision-making processes within which children are prominent actors. Giving children some semblance of presence, voice, significance in the conversation is a vital step towards focusing on anti-oppression and equity. Equity, anti-oppression mean that all voices are taken into consideration when it comes to problem solving, when it comes to developing rules, procedures, laws, and so on. And that's tough to do if only one side of the conversation is being heard, because it's the side that has always been heard and has always been respected. This leads now into what does it mean within my classroom, or within a classroom in general? What does it mean to have an anti-oppressive, equity-focused classroom? And this is where Daphne and Sugru focus on five key components of such five anti-oppressive practices. And they begin with cultural humility and understanding the value of different cultures and understanding the limits or the caveats of our own. One society, one culture versus another should not be a competition. Canada prides itself on being a cultural mosaic, an incorporation and a fostering of all sorts of different cultural backgrounds, faith backgrounds. Well, that's meaningless if it's combative uh, in terms of which one is more appreciated or respected. So being able to have a semblance of humility in terms of one's culture and appreciation or consideration of other cultures is a key first step in that regard. Also, being able to challenge oppression and injustice. Again, this kind of dials back to Sheree's note about resisting and actively participating in these processes, not just lecturing about them. It's very easy to lecture and talk about all the wrongs in the world, but that doesn't mean very much if it doesn't also involve a solution or a strategy or an effort to correct that, to make wrongs right. Focusing on building relationships with students and families. The importance of this is that having conversations about anti-oppression and about equity means that we have to talk about the ideas of privilege and talk about biases, and that in our society it's tough to have a privilege when others do not have it. We are privileged versus somebody else. So the idea of providing all privileges to all people means that that hierarchy of dominant versus minority groups, in terms of what D'Angelo and Sensor refer to in their text, means that that's a tough conversation to have for people who are not used to that. And I do have to understand that I am part of that. When I look at Senso and D'Angelo, when they chart all the different comparisons of dominant versus minority groups of power, when I look at that list, I am the dominant in all ways, shapes, and form, except for one criterion. So that means that it's easy for me to say, let's talk about privilege and bias when I'm in the position of I have all of it. So it's important for me to understand my position, understand the extent of my power, and also recognize how incorporated this power has become in terms of interacting with those who do not. So this means checking privilege, checking bias, and checking that my practices, my expectations, my discussions, conversations, and so on, are framed from a position of anti-oppression, and that what I foster, what I promote, is what can grow even further within a classroom. This also means support and accountability within the school community. It is tough long term to make a big change if it's self-contained and it doesn't get to grow, doesn't get to foster. That when students leave my classroom, for example, that they're not surrounded by an environment that resembles in any way, shape, or form what we've been focusing on, talking about, discussing. It's tough for those messages and the thought processes to stick if it disappears the second that students leave the door. So having a school community that also uh, focuses on anti-oppression and equity frame practices is important to really instill positive change. And finally, they support modifying the curriculum. Now, there are limits within modifying the curriculum that we are mandated contractually to teach, but with our outcomes-based assessment, our outcomes-based curriculum, there are many openings to have those conversations as part of our efforts to achieve all aspects of the curriculum. Now, Kuhn posed an article about contract grading, focusing on, in a university structure, focusing on providing the means for um, certain minority groups uh, who've experienced who are disadvantaged in terms of other aspects of their education to find success in a post-secondary structure. And the idea of contract grading being that it takes the ambiguity out and it takes away the privilege advantage, I suppose we would say, for those who were raised in a certain background, um, and takes away sort of and brings things to sort of a neutral, equitable front by instituting a contract of um, the completion of XYZ criteria, resulting in ABC grade. And the study found that based on the implementation and the feedback, that there was increased student motivation, increased autonomy in the classroom, and the development of a strong learning community. And this comes back to Cohen and Winus's point about the democratic process, having semblance of voice, choice, and contribution in terms of one's place within society or within a learning structure in this case. So I do think that those are actionable steps that I could take within my own classroom in an elementary, middle school structure. Finally, this is point 5, thinking about how my plan represents activism. I do believe that this represents activism because it requires it's the continuation of theory and implementing that theory into daily meaningful practice. It's easy to say that one's an activist when it's a special event or something like that, but true activism, I do believe, is ongoing, it's continuous, it's consistent, persistent, and the means to incrementally promote change. So I do believe that these steps here are a manageable or a meaningful way to recognize my current limits and grow my capacity as an anti-oppressive, equity-framed educator so that I may move into the classroom um, and engage in those conversations, engage in those thought processes to instill positive change in order to make my classroom, my school, my community ultimately a better a better representation of what a 21st century, a true equitable 21st century society can be.